In today's video, I will go over manually installing and configuring PHP version 7.1 on the 64-bit version of Windows 10. PHP is one of the popular web programming languages available in the world that you can use. Before I get started, I should mention that there are automated installers that make installing PHP, the web server and the database server, much easier than manually installing it. And those include options such as XAMPP, WAMP server. There is also a commercial version of PHP called Zend server that you can go and download and try out. And it'll literally set this stuff up in less than 5 minutes. So if you're interested in doing that, this is not the right video to be watching. I would recommend doing another search for a video that deals with either of those three options. For the rest of you, I'll go over manually downloading and installing PHP, in particular the version of PHP that will work with Apache. I covered manually installing and setting up the Apache 2.4 web server in a different video, which is linked over on the left-hand side of the screen. I will also go over configuring PHP and showing you how you can run PHP's built-in web server. It does include one, although the majority of people that I know, they use other web servers that hook into PHP, because that's how it was done before the built-in web server came along. And finally, I'll hook Apache 2.4, that web server, to use PHP. Along the way, I will encounter a number of errors that I will go over working around and troubleshooting that you may or may not encounter. I provided a table of contents in the video description. If you don't want to watch me troubleshooting an error, please feel free to skip ahead. To download PHP in a web browser, go to php.net, which is the home of PHP, a popular general purpose scripting language that is especially suited for web development. The downloads will display the current available versions. Click on Windows Downloads. The most current versions of PHP are displayed at the top, and there's two different flavors of PHP. There is a non-thread safe version that is for Microsoft's IIS server. It's mentioned what the differences are on the left-hand side over here. The second flavor of PHP that's available is the thread-safe version, and that's the one I will use for Apache. Now, the important thing to remember is the version of PHP that I will download and use needs to match what the Apache web server is using in terms of the version of the Visual Studio C++ compiler that was used to build the web server. Both of the PHP and the web server are compiled with a Visual Studio compiler, and those versions, as well as if it's 32-bit or 64-bit, need to match. Otherwise, it won't work when I try to hook the PHP programming language into the web server. I'll encounter an error. The way you can figure out which version of Apache that you're using is to browse to your Apache web server binaries directory and run httpd-v, and it will show you the server version. In parentheses it will say either Win32 for the 32-bit version of Apache or Win64 for the 64-bit version of Apache. If I'm using the 64-bit version of Apache 2.4, I'll need to download the thread-safe 64-bit version of PHP. I can tell it's 64 by the X64, and I would click on the zip link, and I would save the file to my downloads folder. If you're running the 32-bit version of Apache, you would download the x86 thread-safe version of PHP and save that to your folder. In your downloads folder, right-click on the PHP archive that you've downloaded, choose Extract All, and I'll extract it to C:\PHP. Click on Extract. Now that PHP is extracted, let's see if it runs. In a command prompt window, change to the PHP directory. The PHP executable is named php.exe. I'll type in php -v to display which version it is. And I get an error saying the program can't start because VC runtime 140.dll is missing from your computer. The PHP program executable is compiled with Visual Studio C++, and it requires some DLL files for it to run. This is contained within a package called the Microsoft Visual C++ Runtime. Over on the left-hand side, there is a mention of that it requires this runtime, this redistributable runtime library. Since I've downloaded the version of PHP that was compiled with the Visual C++ 14 compiler, I'll need to download the redistributable for Visual Studio 2015, and they provide a link to the Microsoft website over on the left-hand side. So I'll click on that link. It will take me to a download page. For the 64-bit version of PHP, you would check this option. For the 32-bit version of PHP, you would check the x86 option. Since I downloaded the 64-bit version of PHP, I would check this and then click on Next. Save it to my desktop. In my Downloads folder, I would run the redistributable executable, and it would prompt me with a screen to install this. Since I've already installed it, but I intentionally messed up the installation to get that error to occur for this video, I'll click on Repair. You would click on Install. For me, it says uninstall because I already have it installed. Choose Yes. Close the dialog. Try running PHP again. And this time the error does not appear anymore, the runtime error. The next step is to configure PHP. There is a PHP INI file that you will need to copy from the PHP directory. They provide a development version and a version of the PHP configuration for production. Copy the development INI file and paste it into the PHP folder and rename it to php.ini. In my PHP directory, I should see a PHP INI file there since I've copied it. In Notepad, I'll edit the PHP INI file. Date functions require a time zone. If you try to run the PHP date function without a time zone setting set, and I'll do an edit find on time zone, it will output an error. It provides a link to a web page for the time zone settings. There is a link on the help page for a list of supported time zones Navigating to there, you can select your country and pick the appropriate time zone for your area. You copy it and then paste it into your PHP INI file. Removing the semicolon for the beginning of the line will uncomment and make that setting enabled. There is also an include path setting. That I will enable. And I'll choose the Windows version since I'm running Windows. Find the extension dir setting. Enable the Windows version of that setting by removing the semicolon. They have quite a few extension settings that you can go and enable depending on what you want to do. For example, if you want to connect to other websites, you can enable the PHP curl DLL setting. If you want to connect to a MySQL database server, you would enable the MySQL I DLL to allow you to use PHP functions to connect to a MySQL database. And there are other extensions listed further down below, and you don't have to enable all of them. You just enable the ones that you would need. There is another setting I should mention, and it's called memory. If you look for memory underscore limit, you normally don't have to deal with it, but if you deal with larger applications that consume a lot of memory, you may have to increase this setting, but generally you don't have to. So you would save the PHP configuration file. Another thing I'll do is I will add PHP to my system path. I'll look for the word path, click on edit system environment variables, click on environment variables, and in the system variables, I'll click on path and I'll click on edit, click new, and in here I'll add PHP to my environment variables path. Then click OK out of all those windows. And if you step outside of the PHP directory, you should be able to type PHP. And if it says it's not recognized, what you'll need to do is exit out of the current command prompt window, open a new command prompt, and the PHP command will work. Now, to run PHP's built-in web server, I'll navigate to my Apache my Apache 24. I created a docs directory in another tutorial, and I have an index.html page. To run PHP's built-in web server, type PHP space dash uppercase S followed by localhost : and then the port, which the default port is 80. Optionally, you can add a -t parameter to specify a document root directory. I'll just use the current directory and omit that option. And when I run it, I get an error saying failed to listen on localhost : 80. An attempt was made to access a socket in a way forbidden by its access permissions. One cause of this error message is that if you have another program already using port 80, you would need to stop that first to help identify which program is already using port 80, which is a common port used to listen to incoming requests for web pages, type in netstat space -AO, and when I press enter, it will display a lot of information. It's showing me which programs are using which ports on my machine. And I can limit that by typing in the netstat command -AO space pipe find str space and the port number that I'm looking for, which is :80. And it prints out 2 lines with a number at the very end, and that number is the program ID of the program currently using port 80. Use the task list /svc command to find out which program ID is using that port, and we'll tell it to find the process ID that is equal to 6164. And it shows me that I have the Apache web server already running and it's using port 80. So I'll need to stop that first before using PHP's built-in web server. I will run the PHP command again to run the built-in PHP web server. And it's up and running. In a web browser, I should be able to go to localhost, press enter, and it says this is my test website, which all it is an HTML page. Just to make sure that it works with processing PHP pages, I'll create a new file called index.php. And write some PHP code to say this is a test PHP page. Save the file, and when I start it now, it says this is a test PHP page, so it prefers the PHP page over the index.html page. Another interesting thing I should mention is that for some older versions of PHP pages, they are written without the PHP after the question mark. And when I try running it this time, it does not display anything. But if I look at the source of the web page, I actually see the contents of the web page being displayed. There's actually a configuration option available to display the older version of how some PHP pages were written in the past. And to enable this setting, and this only is applicable if you are working with older legacy PHP web pages built 6 to 8 years ago. I need to change the filter to include all files. Look for the setting called short open tag. Change that setting to on. I'll save the file. I may have to, yes I do. I'll have to stop the built-in web server by pressing Control-C and start the built-in web server again. And this time when I reload the web page, I actually see PHP interpreting the contents of the PHP code. The final part of the video, I will go over how to hook PHP into the Apache web server. So when you run request a web page in Apache with a PHP extension, it knows to run PHP instead of just displaying the web page. There is an installation guide included with PHP. Double click on install.txt. Locate the installation instructions for Apache. Even though we're using 2.4, it will work with using the Apache 2.0.x instructions. So do a search in the install.txt file for Apache 2.0.x. Scroll down until you hit a section that talks about installing as an Apache module. In particular, we're after the one that says install PHP and Apache. Well, it has an example that says PHP and an Apache 2.0 as a module. Even though I'm using Apache 2.4, this will still work. We'll need to copy these lines that has for PHP 7, do something like this, and configure the path to PHP INI. I'll copy these settings, browse to your Apache installation directory. Mine is in Apache 24conf, and edit the httpd.conf file in Notepad. I'll do a search in here for add type. And at the top of the list, I'll paste the contents of the instructions that I copied from the install.txt file and paste it into my Apache configuration file. Save the file, and all I need to do now is in my Apache monitor is click on Start. And I get an error that says the requested operation has failed. So something has gone wrong when I'm trying to start Apache. It could be anything from a typo in my configuration file, another program blocking port 80 that prevents Apache to run, or it could be something completely different. And a way to troubleshoot what's going on is to, well, actually I had PHP running from the command line. So that I had PHP's built-in web server still running. So that could have been the problem. But the only way to really make sure is to run the Apache web server, which is httpd.exe, from the command line to see what's going on. And I'll include an option -- console to display all messages to the screen. And I see a syntax error on the Apache configuration that says cannot load PHP 7 Apache 2.dll. The specified module could not be found. So I'll go back to my Apache configuration, and it's complaining about this line. In my Apache directory, the DLL file is actually named PHP 7 Apache 2_4.dll. So I'll need to adjust this path setting to also have a 2_4 in it so that the name of the file matches, and I'll save it. Try running the web server again. The error message looks the same, but there is a %1 is not a valid Win32 application. You get this error message when you try to use the 32-bit version of a PHP with the 64-bit version of Apache. Both bit versions have to match. Otherwise, you'll see this error message. What you'll need to do is go back to the PHP website and download the version of PHP that matches the version in terms of 32 or 64-bit that matches the version of the Apache web server that you're using. Since I'm using the 64-bit version of Apache, I'll need to use the thread-safe 64-bit version of PHP, and they need to be also compiled with the same version of the Visual Studio compiler, and it's designated with VC and then a number. Those also need to match. So when I go and I download this, and what I can do is take my 32-bit version of PHP, I'll just rename it to 32-bit, and I can go into my downloads folder, extract the 64-bit version of PHP, and I can take the configuration file PHP INI from the 32-bit version of PHP and paste it into the 64-bit PHP folder. And this time when I run the Apache 2 web server from the command line, it does not display errors in it, and it should be running, which I can confirm by going to localhost, and it says this is my test website. I'll press Control-C to stop my Apache web server, and since it's not stopping, I'll kill the task using Task Manager. I'll find it. Well, that's this one, the background process. I'll find it, choose End Task, and then I'll start it in my Apache Windows Service Monitor. And now this time it starts and the error message goes away. But as you can see, it says this is my test website, which is actually index.html, and it's not seeing index.php. So there's one more setting that we have to change. In my main Apache configuration file, I'll look for the word index.html. I know that we'll find it. There is a directory index setting, and this tells it what files to look for. And before index.html, I'll add index.php, save the file, restart the web server, and when I refresh the page, it'll say this is a test PHP page. So now it knows to look for index.php files and prefer those over index.html files. That's it for this video, and of course, thanks for watching.